Colonel Shetkin had been missing from his headquarters since early morning, for the simple reason that the headquarters no longer existed. Shetkin's headquarters had already withdrawn to the vicinity of the railroad station on the night of the 14th and had spent the night in the Rose of Stamboul Hotel, right alongside the telegraph office. The field telephone still squealed occasionally in Shetkin's room, but towards dawn it grew silent. At daybreak, two of Colonel Shetkin's aides vanished without trace. An hour later, after searching furiously for something in his trunks and tearing certain papers into shreds, Shetkin himself left the squalid little Rose of Stamboul, although no longer wearing his regulation greatcoat and shoulder straps. He was dressed in a civilian fur coat and trilby hat, which he had suddenly and mysteriously acquired. Taking a cab a block away from the Rose, Shetkin the civilian drove to Lipki, where he arrived at a small but cozy and well-furnished apartment, rang the bell, kissed the buxom golden-haired woman who opened the door and retired with her to the secluded bedroom. The blonde woman's eyes widened with terror as he whispered to her face, "It's all over. God, I'm exhausted," with which Colonel Shetkin sank down onto the bed and fell asleep after a cup of black coffee prepared by the loving hands of the lady with golden hair. Hash. The cadets of the 1st Infantry Detachment knew nothing of this. This was a pity, for if they had known, it might have roused their imagination, and instead of cowering under shrapnel fire at Post Valence they might have set off for that comfortable apartment in Lipki, dragged out the sleepy Colonel Shetkin and hanged him from the lamppost right opposite the blonde creature's apartment. They would have done well to do so, but they did not because they knew nothing and understood nothing. Indeed, no one in the city understood anything, and it would probably be a long time before they did. A few rather subdued steel-helmeted Germans could still be seen around the city, and for all anyone knew the foxy hetman with his carefully trimmed mustaches, that morning only very few people yet knew of the wounding of the mysterious Major von Schrott, was still there, as were His Excellency Prince Belarukov and General Kartuzov, busy forming detachments for the defense of the mother of Russian cities. Nobody yet knew that they had run away that morning. In fact, the city was ominously deserted. The name Petliura still aroused fury in the city, and that day's issue of the news was full of jokes at Petliura's expense, made by corrupt refugee journalists from St. Petersburg. Uniformed cadets were still walking around the city, yet out in the suburbs people could already hear the whistling sound of Petliura's motley cavalry troops cracking their whips as his lancers crossed from the left to the right flank at an easy gallop. If the cavalry is only 3 miles out of town, people asked, what hope can there be for the hetman? And it's his blood they're out for. Perhaps the Germans will back him up? But in that case, why were the tin-hatted Germans grinning and doing nothing as they stood on Fastoff station and watched trainload after trainload of Petliura's troops being brought up to the assault? Perhaps an agreement has been made with Petliura to let his troops occupy the city peacefully? But if so, why the hell are the white officers' guns still shooting at Petliura? The fact was that no one in the city knew what was happening on that 14th of December. The field telephones still rang in the headquarters, but less and less often. Ring. What's happening? Ring. Send more ammunition to Colonel Stepanov. Colonel Ivanov. Antonov. Stratonov. We should pull out and join Denikin on the Don. Things don't seem to be working out here. To hell with those swine at headquarters. To the Don. By noon the telephones had almost stopped ringing altogether. There would be occasional bursts of firing in the city's outskirts, then they would die down. But even at noon, despite the sound of gunfire, life in the city still kept up a semblance of normality. The shops were open and still doing business. Crowds of people were streaming along the sidewalks, doors slammed, and the streetcars still rumbled through the streets. It was at midday that the sudden cheerful stutter of a machine gun was heard coming from Pekhorsk. The Pekhorsk hills echoed to the staccato rattle and carried the sound to the center of the city. Hey, that was pretty near. What's going on? Passers-by stopped and began to sniff the air, and suddenly the crowds on the sidewalks thinned out. What was that? Who is it? Dat-tat-ta-ta. Dat-ta-ta. Ta. Ta. Who is it? Who? Don't you know? It's Colonel Bulbotun. So much for the story that Bulbotun had turned his coat and deserted Petliura. Hash. Bored with trying to execute the complex maneuvers devised by Colonel Toropet's general staff mind, Bulbotun had decided that events needed a little speeding up. His mounted troops were freezing as they waited beyond the cemetery due south of the city, a stone's throw away from the majestic snowbound Dnieper. Bulbotun was frozen too. He suddenly raised his cane in the air and his regiment of horse began moving off in threes, swung onto the road and advanced towards the flat ground bordering the outskirts of the city. Here Bulbotun encountered no resistance. The noise of 6 of his machine guns echoed around the garden suburb of Nizhnaya Telika. In a trice Bulbotun had cut across the line of the railroad and stopped a passenger train which had passed the switches across the railroad bridge, carrying a fresh load of Muscovites and Petersburgers with their elegant women and fluffy lapdogs.